Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about The Secret in the Old Attic. Now, you may remember from a few episodes ago, I guess it's been a couple months ago now, but I was talking about the fact that I talk in my sleep, and apparently, according to my husband, I was talking about trying to find something in an attic, so Nancy Drew is officially creeped into my subconscious. So I was probably talking about this book, but I remember a little bit more of this book than I have a couple of the last books we've talked about on the podcast. This one really had some elements to it that scared me as a kid, and I can happily report that it's just as scary reading it as an adult. But this is the 21st book in the series, and it was first published in 1944. So we've got 3 separate book covers to discuss on today's episode, and if you ever want to see these, I post them on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, on Wednesdays. So for the first edition of this cover, the one from 1944, we have Nancy with what's kind of become her signature blonde hairstyle. She's kind of got the victory rolls and the curls. And she is up in an attic. Of course, she's wearing high heels because she's Nancy Drew. Why wouldn't you go up in an attic in high heels in your best dress? But she is leaned over a trunk. There's a bunch of bottles and what looks like a sewing wheel in the background, and sheet music. And if you look over her shoulder, you can see what looks like a skeleton kind of peering out from this wardrobe, which is super creepy. Honestly, this cover is beautifully done. Like the lighting and the shadows, like it's perfectly captured, and Nancy's kind of holding a candle. But this cover and the next cover, these are probably my top favorite covers of all the Nancy Drew books. I just feel like they really capture who Nancy is. So for the second edition of this cover, we again have Nancy up in the attic, and she's got her hand on this lid of this trunk. There's sheet music around, but in this cover, there's still the skeleton kind of peering out of the wardrobe at her, but she's wearing a bright red dress and she's got red hair, and this is just my favorite cover of all time. I've actually got it as the background on my phone because it just, I don't know, it's just so mysterious, and it screams mystery to me. Like, out of all the covers we've seen up to this point, this is Nancy Drew to me. Now, for the third flashlight edition cover of this book, we have Nancy with her strawberry blonde hair. She's wearing a blue dress. It's very 60s looking, and she's got a candle in her hand, but she's kind of just in the foreground of this cover, and we've got a skeleton hand behind her and a shadowy figure in a trunk. And it's still a good cover. It's pretty creepy, but it's not nearly as well done as the first two. So I came up with a funny cover spoof for this book, and what I came up with is I may have a couple of skeletons in my closet, because as if it's not creepy enough that Nancy is up in this attic and there's a bunch of cobwebs and just dust everywhere, we've got this skeleton just kind of leering out of this closet, and that comes into play later in the book as well. So I like when the book covers actually have something to do with the plot of the book. So I gave these book covers a rating of 5 magnifying glasses. I absolutely love these covers, and especially the first 2. They're just so beautiful, and they're just neat. When I think of Nancy Drew, I think of these covers in particular, and I think it's so interesting how, these different artists have adapted Nancy over the years. And I mean, in the 80s, they gave her big hair, and she changed so much throughout the eras. But I think if we were to ask ourselves, like, what's our favorite Nancy Drew book cover, we would all probably have 4 or 5 in mind, because that's just how we envision Nancy. So I wrote down some of the characters that are in this book, so I thought we would go ahead and discuss those really quick. So there's a Patrick and Susan March. They're a grandfather and a granddaughter that Nancy is trying to help out in this mystery. And there is Philip and Connie, who were Susan's parents, who are both passed. And we see Effie come into the story again, and she is Hannah Guerin's niece, who also is a housekeeper for people at times. We also have a Mr. Booker, who is a client of Carson's that he's trying to help, and he's basically trying to figure out if this other company that makes fabric is stealing his formula. There's also a Bushy Trot, who turns out to be a spy. Mr. Dite, who owns the rival fabric company, who is a competition for Mr. Booker. And Mr. Dite has a daughter named Diane who went to school with Nancy, and they weren't exactly friends, and that plays into the plot a little bit. And then there is Ben Banks / Harry Hall, and these are the people who are saying that they wrote Philip March's music, and they're actually plagiarizing it. So I'm going to go ahead and read the synopsis, but I will say, if you have arachnophobia, this episode will be a fun one for you. I hate spiders so much. I'm terrified of them. And when I read this book as a kid, it really cemented that for me. I was like, okay, yeah, this is a realistic fear to have, but I'll go ahead and read the synopsis, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the episode. Our mystery begins with Carson saying he's been asked by a Patrick March for help finding a clue to some lost music by reading some of his son and daughter-in-law's love letters. His son, Philip, died during an army training exercise, and he hopes, if found, the music will provide for his granddaughter, Susan. Nancy agrees to help, but as Mr. March is leaving, a man throws a rock at his head. The Drews make him stay, and when Nancy leaves a radio on for him, he recognizes the tune and says his son wrote it, and someone has stolen his music. Nancy, Bess, and George start to look in the attic at the Marches' residence for the hidden music, but are interrupted when Susan is brought home by the woman who was briefly looking after her. It's discovered that Susan has the measles. Nancy calls a doctor and reassures Mr. March she will keep looking for the music, but in the meantime she has found some valuable antiques she can help him sell to help the family get by. Nancy also contacts Effie, Hannah Gruen's niece, to see if she can come and help with the housekeeping duties. When Nancy returns the next day, Effie says she saw a man prowling around the house at night. Nancy is afraid this is who has been stealing the music. She also simultaneously tries to help her dad solve a case. Booker and Dite have two companies that have a very similar process for making fabric, but Dite's company uses black widows. Bushy Trot was working for one company and then stole the ideas and took them to Dite. Nancy also finds music behind the wallpaper at the Marches' house and in a desk in a secret room. Nancy is overtaken by Bushy Trot in the attic, who was stealing the music and has one of the, I believe, scariest near-death experiences yet. So for the newspaper headline synopsis, I came up with this: She can't be beat. Nancy Drew uncovers stolen music scheme. See more on page 11. So I took down several direct quotes and notes for this book. It was a very fun book to read, so let's jump right into them. So the first thing that I wrote down is a man throws a rock at Patrick March's head. And this happens a lot in Nancy Drew's presence. Either she's getting rocks thrown at her or Carson or just people who come to call and visit on them. It's just people who are like not wanting Nancy to solve these mysteries, but that's a very common thing. I think we've seen this several times in the last few books. I also wrote down that Susan gets the measles and Nancy calls a doctor. And we haven't really talked about it much, but the practice of calling a doctor for a house call is like almost non-existent today. That really kind of shows the difference in the time period. It's so neat to me. But yeah, I just took a note of that. I also thought it was neat that Effie, Hannah's niece, shows up again. So Effie has been in several of the books. I think she was in Password to Larkspur Lane, and there's another book that she was in. But yeah, she shows up and she always helps out when Nancy needs her. Effie also has a funny habit of just getting really excited or scared of things too, though. And I can tell, like, sometimes in reading the books that she's in, Nancy gets a little aggravated with her. So the next thing that I wrote down, and this is just an observation, but the Nancy Drew books get better and better the further we go, just the way that they're written, the descriptions. So when Nancy's looking in the attic, she gets scared of a skeleton in a wardrobe, and it says a long, bony arm reached out towards Nancy's throat, and that was just like, kind of freaky. But there's things like this, and there's a couple other instances in the books that it's just really good writing. And Mr. March says that his son, Philip, got the skeleton from a medical student, so it's most likely real, which I was like, oh gosh, like you don't even think about that, you know? I mean, like Halloween, people have like fake skeletons up, but it's a little bit scarier that it's actually probably a real skeleton. So the next note that I wrote down is Madame Perret is a dressmaker in town, and as part of Nancy's plan to help Carson on his case, she goes with George to her mom's dress fitting, and she asks about Diane Dight. And there's this whole little segment where there's an atrocious French accent involved because Madame Perret is French, but I did think it was interesting how Nancy just really went above and beyond to help her dad with his case too. Because part of this involves Nancy getting close to Diane Dight, who is a girl that went to school with her and she really doesn't like her, but in order to help her dad figure out if this opposing factory that makes fabric has stolen his client's formula, Nancy has to kind of get close to Diane. So the next thing that I wrote down is Diane Dight, who is a notorious snob, compliments Nancy on the dress she's wearing, which Hannah made. So it's just implied here that Diane would never wear anything that was homemade. You know, she goes to this fancy dress shop and gets all her clothes made. And so Nancy goes home and tells Hannah later, like, oh, your clothing is, you know, approved by Diane Dight. So I thought that was kind of funny. And Hannah must be a pretty excellent seamstress. So Nancy sets up this elaborate ruse to tour the fabric factory by picking Diane up from the train station, and she asks the secretary for a tour and convinces her to let her look around. And so Nancy finds a door marked danger, don't enter, and thinks she sees Bushy Trot, this man that her dad has told her to be on the lookout for. And so she screams to get the door to open again and pretends to faint in order to poke around. And it actually works. So Bushy Trot he brings her in and he, you know, starts fanning her and goes to get her some water. And Nancy gets to look around at this room and kind of see the inner workings of this fabric factory. But I was like, that's so funny that, I mean, screaming would get most people's attention. So it definitely worked. So the next thing that I wrote down has to do with that skeleton that we saw on the cover of the book and the one that kind of jumped out at Nancy in the closet of the attic. Effie says that it bit her, but it was really a black widow. So they make this big deal, you know, Effie starts to get sick, they have to call a doctor, and I was just like, oh, that's my worst nightmare, to be bit by a spider. So this next note is really creepy. Nancy's flashlight dies, and the book says something landed with a soft thud against her hand, and out of nowhere floated a few eerie notes from a harp. Chills ran up and down her spine. So you see what I mean? Like the writing is just getting so much better, and I don't know, just there's something about being in a dark room and your flashlight goes out. Like that's just, ugh. I mean, anything could be up there. You could trip over something. There's obviously spiders up there that are poisonous. So, that part was very scary. So the next thing that I wrote down, Nancy infiltrates the Dight factory, and the writing is so good. There's so much suspense, and she sees these black widow spiders and gets a sample of the chemicals, and then she has to escape. But that whole chapter, I was just like, oh gosh, Nancy's going to get caught, or she's going to get bit by a spider. I don't know what's going to happen, but it was just written very well. The next note that I have down, Nancy finds music that Philip March wrote behind the wallpaper in the March's house. And I remember as a kid thinking that would be so cool to just be in this house and then you just start ripping off the wallpaper and you find all these things. I've heard of people finding like murals and different things in really old houses. But that was such a cool place and so creative of a place to hide the music. And Horace Dight, Mr. Dight, who is the father of Diane and owns the rival fabric factory, is actually Ben Banks, the one who was plagiarizing this music. And I thought, whoa, that's such a twist. I thought it was going to be somebody else, and that really threw me for a loop. The next thing that I took note of is Bushy Trot grabs Nancy in the attic. And this is what he said, and it was very creepy. He said, I trust that this little creature will fix you so you'll remember nothing of this episode. You wonder what this is? A black widow, my dear detective. And then he shakes the bottle and leaves Nancy tied up in the attic with the angry black widow just scurrying around. And I remember as a kid just being like, oh my gosh, that's so terrifying. Like, it's dark. You don't know where this thing is. Gives me the chills. But it's all okay in the end because Ned saves her. So Ned comes just in the nick of time and has a light, and the Black Widow spider is only about 2 feet from Nancy. And I was just like, oh my gosh. But this reminded me of, sidebar, an interesting thing that happened to me when I got married. So on my wedding day, as if I wasn't already terrified of spiders as it was, I was getting pictures. We were doing our pictures and our first look, and this huge wolf spider, unbeknownst to me, was in my dress. It was between the lining and the lace of the dress. And everybody there was like, oh, it looks like there's a leaf in your dress. Well, no, it was a spider, and it was about the size of my hand. And when I say that I freaked out, oh my gosh. But a lot like Ned saving Nancy, Tim, my husband, saved the day and somehow got the spider off of me, and not only didn't ruin the dress, but stomped the thing to death. But Ned does a similar thing in the attic and kills the spider. But when I was reading that, I was like, this sounds very familiar. Moral of the story, find someone that will kill the spiders in your life for you, because if you're scared of them like me, all I can do is like just freak out. And so I'm so glad that Ned saved Nancy. Now, as for the What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen section of this podcast, Hannah only really cooked once, and this is a weird dish. This seems like the vintage version of Hamburger Helper, but she made hamburger and rice pudding. I don't know. It just sounds a little weird. Anything with pudding after it doesn't sound very good. Now, there were also a few things that I thought that Nancy could add to her resume, and one of them was antique appraiser. So while she's trying to help the Marches find their son's music, she finds all these other things in the attic that they can sell to help them make money. So Nancy has an eye for expensive things, and she did a great job of appraising them. I also put that Nancy is a laboratory explorer because she just infiltrated these factories like it was no big deal. It was just like, oh yeah, I'll just slip in here and nobody will know. And she collected all those chemical samples, and that was so cool to me. So as for the things that I liked about this book, I loved the spooky attic and the spooky criminals. There was a lot of adrenaline in this book, and I thought it was just kind of neat that the stakes were so high. Also, I thought a neat element to this mystery was, since Nancy was helping Carson on his case, she didn't really divulge any of that information to Bess and George. So she still sees Bess and George at points during the book, but she can't really tell them anything. So that was kind of an interesting element. And my absolute favorite thing was the fact that Ned saved Nancy from that spider, because I was just like, oh my gosh, it was just so tense, especially for me to read, and I was so glad that he was able to get to her in time. And for the things that I didn't like, I actually didn't write anything down. I loved this book. It was interesting to read. The cover art was great on it. It flowed so well, whereas the book before this was kind of choppy and a lot of things didn't make sense to me. This was a great book, so for that reason, I gave it 5 magnifying glasses. So yeah, that concludes this episode for The Secret in the Old Attic. I hope you all liked this one. I would highly recommend this book. This has probably been one of my favorites to date out of all the ones that we've read. So for next week's episode, we're going to be talking about The Crumbling Wall. So if you like hidden treasure and castles, then you are really going to like this one. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.